December 1941. The Pacific was burning. The rising sun flag flew over Manila, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Japanese Zero fighters dominated the skies, and Tokyo believed it had just humiliated the most powerful nation on Earth. But what Japanese commanders didn't yet realize was that they had just awakened an industrial giant, and that giant was about to do something that would defy imagination. By the end of the war, the United States would produce nearly 100,000 military aircraft in a single year. Fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers, flooding the skies with more machines of war than Japan could ever hope to match. Japanese commanders, stunned by the scale, simply couldn't believe what they were facing. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are rediving into one of the most jaw-dropping industrial feats in human history, how the United States turned its factories into an unstoppable war machine and shocked the Japanese high command with its ability to build more planes than anyone thought possible. This is the story of how America built 100,000 planes and changed the course of World War II. In 1939, the U.S. military was far from ready for global war. Its Army Air Corps had fewer than 2,500 planes, many of them outdated biplanes. The idea of producing tens of thousands of aircraft a year seemed like fantasy. America was still recovering from the Great Depression, and public opinion was strongly against joining another European war. But overseas, dark clouds were forming. Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe was devastating Poland and France. Japan was rampaging across China, and its navy was preparing for confrontation in the Pacific. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the U.S. had to prepare, and he issued a challenge. In May 1940, he called for the production of 50,000 warplanes per year, a figure so ambitious that even some of his advisors thought it was impossible. Industry leaders balked. Military officers were skeptical, but FDR wasn't asking. He was declaring a new vision, the arsenal of democracy. At first, production was slow. The auto industry was still building cars. Factories were not yet converted for war. The U.S. had only a handful of major aircraft manufacturers: Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, Grumman, and they were used to producing planes in small batches, not on assembly line scale. Yet in the background, something remarkable was happening. Industrialists like Henry Ford and William Knudsen, the former president of General Motors, stepped forward to organize a nationwide production network. Auto plants, refrigerator factories, and typewriter companies were about to be transformed into airplane builders. The Japanese, meanwhile, were confident that America wouldn't have the willpower to fight a long war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself famously warned Tokyo that he could run wild for 6 months after Pearl Harbor. But beyond that, he feared what American industry might unleash, and he was right to worry. When Japanese pilots attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they destroyed over 180 U.S. aircraft on the ground. They believed they had crippled American air power in the Pacific. What they didn't realize was that those planes would be replaced within weeks, and by 1943, the U.S. would be producing more planes in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. American factories were coming online at breathtaking speed. Ford's Willow Run plant, nicknamed the Arsenal of Democracy, began turning out B-24 Liberator bombers on a mile-long assembly line. By late 1944, it was producing one bomber every hour. For Japanese intelligence officers, the numbers coming out of America seemed like propaganda. Surely one Japanese staff officer wrote, "No nation can build that many planes without collapsing its economy." But America didn't collapse. It accelerated. This was not just a story of machines, it was a story of people. Millions of American workers, including women entering factories for the first time, became the hands that built the air armada. The famous image of Rosie the Riveter was more than propaganda. It was a reflection of the reality that every rivet, every wing panel, every engine was assembled by someone who understood that the fate of the free world was in their hands. By the end of 1942, Japanese commanders were starting to notice something troubling. Allied air raids were becoming more frequent, more coordinated. New planes, like the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt and the long-range P-38 Lightning, were appearing over the Pacific. Something big was happening. But they still had no idea just how big it really was, because America was only getting started. The early days of America's wartime mobilization were chaotic, but they were also electrifying. It was as if an entire nation had suddenly decided to roll up its sleeves and get to work. Factories that once built sedans and washing machines were suddenly hammering out airplane wings and fuselage frames. Civilian engineers were called into military service not to fight, but to design. And across the country, new airfields, training centers, and supply depots were being carved into the landscape. But none of this happened overnight. In fact, the first months after Pearl Harbor were some of the most dangerous for America. In early 1942, Japan was on the offensive everywhere. They had captured Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, and were threatening Australia. Their Zero fighter was superior to almost anything America had in the air, and Japanese naval aviation was at its peak. Washington knew that if America was going to win, it would have to do something radical. Turn the entire nation into a war machine. Enter William Knudsen, the former head of General Motors. Roosevelt had personally called him to Washington and given him an unprecedented job: direct the conversion of the American economy from peacetime to wartime production. Knudsen, a brilliant organizer, understood that the solution was not just to build more planes, but to build them smarter and faster. "Gentlemen," he told Detroit automakers, "the car you are building today will not win the war. The bomber you build tomorrow will." The scale of the conversion was staggering. In Detroit, auto plants stopped producing cars altogether by February 1942. This was the first time in history that consumer car production in America was completely halted. Instead of Buicks and Fords, these factories started churning out Pratt & Whitney engines, B-24 bomber fuselages, and military trucks. Ford's Willow Run facility became the centerpiece of this transformation. When construction began in 1941, skeptics doubted that Ford could mass-produce heavy bombers the way they mass-produced cars. But Henry Ford believed in assembly line principles, and by late 1942, the plant was operational. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 40,000 workers and produced a B-24 every 63 minutes. Imagine that. In less than the time it takes to watch a movie, an entire 4-engine heavy bomber rolled off the line, ready for war. Meanwhile, the government launched massive training programs to produce pilots and mechanics to fly and maintain these new planes. The U.S. Army Air Forces went from fewer than 20,000 pilots in 1940 to over 193,000 by the end of the war. Training airfields sprang up in Texas, California, Florida, and across the Midwest. On the Japanese side, reports began to filter back to Tokyo that American factories were producing aircraft at a rate the Japanese planners hadn't even considered possible. Japanese intelligence had estimated that America could perhaps build 10,000 aircraft a year. A challenging number, but one Japan believed it could match with its own production. But the reality was far beyond that. By the end of 1942, the United States had already produced 47,800 aircraft, almost 5 times Japan's total. This sudden surge of production gave American commanders something precious: options. When the Battle of Midway came in June 1942, America had just enough carriers, just enough planes, and just enough pilots to turn the tide of the Pacific War. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, and the offensive momentum began to shift. But while Midway was a turning point at sea, it was also a signal for Washington. They needed to double down on production. Every lost plane could now be replaced faster than ever. Every battle would be followed by more reinforcements. And that's when the numbers really began to skyrocket. To keep up with demand, subcontracting networks were created. Companies that had never touched aviation before, like Goodyear, IBM, and even piano manufacturers, were suddenly producing aircraft parts. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, making up more than 30% of the aircraft industry workforce by 1943. They weren't just working on assembly lines. They were building precision instruments, wiring electrical systems, and testing engines. And as production soared, the types of aircraft being built became more specialized. Long-range bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were rolling out in huge numbers. Fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which would later dominate the skies, were just entering production. By the end of 1943, America wasn't just matching Japanese air power, it was overwhelming it. Japanese commanders were starting to realize something alarming. Every time they destroyed a squadron of U.S. planes, more seemed to appear. It was like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more took its place. The Imperial Japanese Navy simply could not keep up. Their aircraft production peaked in 1944 at about 28,000 planes, many of them inferior in quality due to shortages of aluminum, fuel, and trained pilots. By contrast, the United States would produce over 96,000 planes in 1944 alone. This was no longer just a war. It was a contest of industrial capacity. And America was winning that contest by a margin that defied belief. By 1943, the full force of America's industrial engine was thundering across the world. The skies were no longer neutral territory. They were becoming an American domain. In the Pacific, the shift was unmistakable. When U.S. forces began their island-hopping campaign, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Gilberts, they had air cover that Japan simply couldn't match. Waves of newly built Wildcats, Hellcats, and Avengers from American carriers began sweeping the skies clean of Japanese planes. The Japanese High Command began receiving reports that were nothing short of terrifying. The Americans weren't just replacing their losses. They were sending more planes than had ever been seen before in the theater. One Japanese naval officer, quoted after the war, said it felt like fighting against the tide. Every time a battle was fought, America came back with more ships, more planes, more pilots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, became the clearest sign yet that Japan was in deep trouble. That day, over 450 Japanese aircraft were sent to attack the U.S. fleet. American radar picked them up early, scrambled Hellcat fighters, and what followed was one of the most lopsided aerial battles in history. By nightfall, around 350 Japanese planes had been shot down, many with their inexperienced pilots still inside. And while this was a devastating blow to Japan, for the United States, those losses could be replaced in a matter of weeks. But this wasn't just happening in the Pacific. Over Europe, the American 8th Air Force was mounting daylight bombing raids deep into Nazi territory. And those raids were possible only because of the staggering production numbers back home. The famous Big Week of February 1944 saw the U.S. launch over 3,500 bomber sorties in just 7 days. Factories, railways, and aircraft plants across Germany were smashed. Back in Washington, military planners weren't worried about running out of bombers. They were worried about building enough airfields in Britain to hold them all. This was the shocking reality that Japanese commanders had feared but never truly believed. America wasn't fighting a war with what it had. It was fighting a war with what it could endlessly produce. At this point, Tokyo's intelligence community was scrambling to update its assessments. Early in the war, they had estimated that America might be able to build 50,000 planes over several years. But by 1944, the numbers were staggering. Over 8,000 planes a month were rolling out of American factories. Let that sink in. Every single month, more aircraft were being produced than Japan could manufacture in an entire year. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Force could not even train pilots fast enough to put them in the cockpits of the planes they did have. In contrast, the United States had built an entire infrastructure of flight schools, simulators, and training ranges to churn out well-trained pilots at a dizzying pace. This is where the psychological impact began to weigh heavily on Japanese commanders. Imagine being an air commander in 1943, sending your best squadrons into battle and seeing them wiped out, only to learn that the enemy's strength had not diminished, but actually increased. Admiral Ugaki, a senior Japanese naval officer, wrote in his diary during this period that the enemy possesses an inexhaustible supply of material and men. Each time we destroy them, they come back in greater numbers. This sense of inevitability began to erode Japanese strategy. Instead of being able to choose their battles, they were forced into desperate defensive operations, throwing pilots into suicidal missions like kamikaze attacks, a grim acknowledgement that they could not match America plane for plane. On the American home front, there was an almost unstoppable momentum. War bond drives, rationing, and patriotic campaigns kept the public engaged. Workers labored around the clock. Entire cities like Seattle, San Diego, and Fort Worth became dominated by aircraft production. And as soon as planes were completed, they were flown off to the front. There was no stockpiling, no sitting idle. The flow of war machines was constant and relentless. By the summer of 1944, America had so many planes that they could open multiple fronts at once, devastating bombing campaigns over Europe and overwhelming air superiority in the Pacific. For Japanese planners, this was the nightmare scenario they had always feared. A two-ocean enemy with endless resources, now fully awake and fully mobilized. And yet, the peak of American production and the full shock it delivered to Japan was still to come. By late 1944, the full weight of American air power was crashing down on Japan, and it was powered by the unprecedented production machine back home. The United States had now surpassed even Roosevelt's ambitious 50,000 plane goal. In 1944 alone, the nation built 96,318 aircraft, nearly 8,000 every single month. Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, they came off assembly lines so quickly that some were flown directly from the factory floor to staging bases. The Japanese commanders who had once dismissed America as soft were stunned. The scale was beyond anything they had imagined. The Pacific skies were now dominated by new American aircraft designed specifically to crush Japan's war machine. The F-6F Hellcat, called the Ace Maker, tore apart the once feared Zero. In fact, Hellcats alone destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft, an astonishing 75% of U.S. Navy aerial victories. Then came the long-range B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of the war. Its 3,000-mile range meant that for the first time, American bombers could strike Japan's home islands directly from bases in the Marianas, and there were plenty of them to spare. By 1945, the U.S. had built over 3,900 B-29s, each capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs. For Japanese commanders, the turning point came when these bombers began firebombing Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities. In a single night in March 1945, over 300 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo, creating a firestorm that killed an estimated 100,000 people. It was the most destructive bombing raid of the entire war, and the Americans could repeat it again and again. One Japanese officer later remarked, "We believed the enemy could not possibly sustain such attacks for long." But the next night, they came again. And the night after that. This constant rain of destruction was made possible because back in the U.S., production never slowed, and the shock for Japan wasn't just the quantity, it was the quality. American planes were being built faster, but they were also better. Faster speeds, heavier firepower, more armor. The legendary P-51 Mustang, which by now was escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, also began appearing in the Pacific, giving the U.S. a fighter that could sweep Japanese skies clear. Meanwhile, Japan's planes were declining in quality. Wartime shortages meant aluminum was replaced with wood in some designs, and training times for pilots were cut drastically, producing aviators with only a fraction of the experience needed to face battle-hardened Americans. By 1945, it was no longer a fair fight, but perhaps the most stunning moment of all came during the Battle of Okinawa. In April 1945, the Japanese launched their largest kamikaze campaign of the war, sending wave after wave of suicide planes against the American fleet. Over 1,500 kamikazes were used, a desperate attempt to slow the Allied advance. Yet even with this all-out effort, the U.S. Navy continued to receive reinforcements faster than they could be sunk. Damaged carriers and battleships were repaired and back in action within weeks. Fresh squadrons of planes arrived almost daily. For Japanese commanders watching from Tokyo, the realization hit hard. There was nothing they could do to stop the flow. The American war machine had reached a level of momentum that could not be reversed. The war had now turned into a race Japan could not win. Every passing month brought more planes, more bombs, and more destruction raining down on their cities, industries, and supply lines. Even German officers, after their surrender in May 1945, expressed astonishment at the scale of American production. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, admitted in his memoirs that Germany never truly understood how powerful American industry was until it was too late. For Japan, the same lesson was becoming painfully clear. No matter how bravely their pilots fought, no matter how many kamikazes they launched, they were being crushed by the sheer weight of American output. And yet, the climax of this story was still to come. Because in the summer of 1945, America's Air Armada would unleash its most shocking and final weapon, a weapon that required just one plane to end the war. By mid-1945, Japan was a nation under siege. Its cities lay in ruins, its industries crippled, and its skies filled with the sound of American bombers. Yet, despite the devastation, Tokyo refused to surrender. And so, the United States prepared to deliver the final crushing blow. The last months of the war were the most devastating air campaign in history. By this point, the U.S. had nearly 80,000 aircraft in service worldwide. Fighters prowled the skies, shooting down anything that tried to take off. Bombers blanketed Japan's cities with fire. Then, the war effort reached its terrible climax: the deployment of the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island, carrying a single bomb codenamed Little Boy. Hours later, Hiroshima was obliterated in a blinding flash. A city of over 300,000 people was reduced to rubble, with tens of thousands killed instantly. 3 days later, another B-29, Bockscar, delivered the second bomb, Fat Man, over Nagasaki. For Japanese commanders, this was the final shock. The most powerful industrial nation in history had now harnessed the power of the atom, and they had no defense against it. Even before the atomic bombs, Japan's air defenses were crumbling. The U.S. had achieved total air supremacy. American pilots roamed the skies with impunity, strafing supply lines, sinking shipping, and even targeting airfields where Japanese planes sat burning on the ground. The sheer number of planes was staggering: thousands of B-29s, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. For the first time, bombers were flying in daylight raids over Japan without fear of significant opposition. One Japanese officer later admitted that it felt as if the sky itself belonged to America. The psychological effect was immense. In the war rooms of Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff knew they were beaten. Their production had collapsed to a fraction of what it had been at the war's start. Aluminum was gone, fuel was scarce, training programs were barely producing pilots who could land safely, much less fight. And still, the bombers came. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito took the unprecedented step of addressing the Japanese nation directly, announcing that Japan would surrender. The decision was a direct consequence of the combined devastation of the atomic bombings and the relentless conventional air campaign that had made continued resistance impossible. For the United States, the resolution was clear. The gamble of becoming the arsenal of democracy had paid off. The goal set by Roosevelt in 1940, 50,000 planes a year, had not only been met, but doubled. By the end of the war, America had built over 300,000 military aircraft. It was a number so vast that many planes never even saw combat. Hundreds sat on airfields awaiting missions that would never come because the war ended first. This wasn't just a military victory. It was an industrial triumph on a scale never before seen in human history. And for the Japanese commanders who had once believed they could win a quick war, the lesson was searing. They had underestimated not just America's will to fight, but its capacity to build. The war in the Pacific was over. But the image of American production lines, mile-long factories turning out bombers by the hour, would haunt Japanese planners for decades to come. The war was over, but the story of America's 100,000 planes didn't end in August 1945. In fact, the aftermath was almost as remarkable as the wartime production miracle itself. When peace was declared, the United States suddenly found itself with a staggering surplus of aircraft, more planes than any nation had ever possessed. Airfields across America and the Pacific were crammed with bombers, fighters, and transports that no longer had missions to fly. Some of these planes had never even left the factory floor before the surrender was announced. What happened next might surprise you. Instead of mothballing them all for future wars, the U.S. government scrapped tens of thousands of perfectly good aircraft. Brand new B-17s, P-51s, and B-24s were parked in giant open-air storage yards, engines drained, and then sold for pennies as surplus, or melted down for aluminum. One scrapyard in Kingman, Arizona, became a haunting graveyard of American air power, with row after row of warplanes sitting under the desert sun, waiting to be cut apart. It was a sobering reminder of just how overwhelming American production had been, that they could afford to throw away thousands of planes and still remain the most powerful air force in the world. But the legacy of this industrial miracle went far beyond the scrapyards. The experience of building 100,000 planes transformed American industry forever. Mass production techniques pioneered during the war carried over into the booming post-war economy. Car manufacturing, electronics, and even consumer goods benefited from the innovations of wartime production. It also reshaped global power. The United States emerged from World War II as the undisputed leader of the free world, its air power unmatched, its factories intact, and its economy surging. Japan, meanwhile, lay in ruins, but in the years that followed, it would study America's methods, rebuild its industries, and eventually become one of the world's great economic powers. And perhaps the most profound legacy of all was the lesson learned by military planners everywhere. Wars are not just won on battlefields, they are won in factories. When Japanese commanders had scoffed at Roosevelt's 50,000 plane goal, they had failed to grasp what was possible when an entire nation mobilized for war. By the time they realized it, it was too late. So the next time you see an old photograph of American bombers lined up wingtip to wingtip on some Pacific Island airstrip, remember that behind every plane was a story, a factory worker, a designer, a pilot in training, and a nation determined to fight until victory. The story of America's 100,000 planes is not just a story of metal and machinery. It is a story of willpower, ingenuity, and an industrial miracle that changed the world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most astonishing feats, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories from history. Drop a comment below. Did you know America produced that many planes during the war? And which aircraft do you think played the biggest role in ending the conflict?